What I thought I would do, just to set the scene in a slightly different context, is to take a step back from the technology for a moment and look a little bit about what the marketplace is doing and what we're seeing is actually happening in our book of business. So Northern Trust is responsible for a global clientele. We have $7 trillion of assets under custody and similar large numbers under administration and management. And so we do talk to a broad range of different clients that represent different parts of the world. And what we're seeing really, and this is particularly the case with alternative assets, so property and private debt, are emerging themes and emerging problems, to use the term that Nick has already referred to, in what they are facing and demands from them in terms of solutions. At the very top is what we're calling data transparency. It's no longer enough now for a custodian just to keep a client's assets safe and to keep them private and to make sure that we get the balance with transparency and all the other things we've heard about already. There is growing demand, significant demand, for us to be able to manage data associated with those assets in a way that we've not seen before. And that covers a whole range of different things, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've done around this topic. But transparency was something that we decided to take out and do some market research on. We partnered with the Economist Intelligence Unit and went across a range of different client owners, asset owners and asset managers to try and establish what exactly they mean by this. And as far as transparency is concerned, we boil it down. I like to simplify these things. I mean, in terms of performance, in terms of risk management, and in terms of fees and how much they're paying, those are three very specific examples of what clients that own these assets are demanding from their custodian and from their fund administrator in a way that we've not seen before. So a very important theme, which is a real industry demand today. There's also a theme around liquidity, trying to make sure that they understand how much money they've got and how they can spend it and how they can spend it quickly to make sure the performance of their fund or of their asset pool is not impacted. Lack of industry standards today, particularly in alternative assets where different countries, different markets will measure things in different ways, and there is a move to standardize globally in some of those areas. And the last thing that we're seeing, particularly from smaller asset owners and asset managers, is a drive to outsource. And so what that means is they're looking for someone to solve these problems for them because they don't have the resources internally to do that. So all of that represents both a list of problems but also a list of opportunities. So we went out to market and we conducted a survey around transparency and what is the theme, what are we seeing, and what's the direction of travel. And as I said, we teamed up with the Economist Intelligence Unit. We went out over to speak to over 200 investors and managers across the globe. All of them had at least $5 billion of assets or more to manage. So we've covered the US, Europe, the Middle East. And the idea was that we also wanted to make sure that we had a broad range of different respondents. So we talked to their chief executives, but also their investment committees and others in their organisation, their IT departments, to make sure that we could try and gather as comprehensive response as we could. And as a result of that, we found some quite interesting themes. The first one is that transparency is ascending in terms of its importance in organisation in a way that was greater than we expected. We had 5 questions that we asked, which range, or five grades on the question from the most important, very important, somewhere in the middle, and then to at the other end of reducing importance. And you can see there that those that answered very important across the range, both for alternative assets and for traditional assets, is up there. Nearly 2/3 said it was in that kind of camp. And you compare that to some of the other headings that we've got: regulations, investment policies, fees. Transparency trumped all of those. So an extremely important emerging trend. Why? What's the significance? What's the driver? 3 top-level themes came out from that question. The first one is that firms are very interested in understanding how to manage portfolio risk in a way that we've not seen before. So risk management within portfolio within a European context has clearly been driven by regulation, and I think many of us in the room have wrestled with that if you're involved in financial services. But globally, across the board, it's no longer enough just to say that, well, I have a diversified portfolio. Questions that we're being asked now is, help me understand what happens if interest rates go up or go down. What happens if inflation starts to trend up? I'm a pension trustee and I want to understand what the implications will be on my funding requirements. What happens if exchange rates move? What's the likely impact if there are some large macro political events that are likely to have a number of different consequences for my portfolio? And when you stand back from those questions, they're not easy to answer without very significant amounts of data to be held around each of the portfolio investments that those clients hold. Because clearly, if you want to understand interest rate movements, you need to understand the maturity profile of every single asset that you hold, and you can then start to make some judgments about how it's likely to respond. And how do you compare a property to a bond? What's the difference, and in what way do they differ in the way they react to those particular movements? So portfolio risk management is a crucial question. But equally, 53% said regulatory requirements was also at the top of their list, and then competitive considerations. The regulatory piece is important, and I think in Europe we probably have a slightly higher importance in that category than some of the other regions of the world. And some of the key drivers behind that are listed below there: consumer protection, data management governance, fiduciary responsibilities, risk management. If you're an asset owner or you're an asset manager, you really do need to be able to demonstrate and evidence that what you're doing with the assets that you're entrusted with is effective and is meeting the requirements of both the law, of regulation, and also the expectations of your client. Transparency post-investment. Now, this was an interesting question. We asked the question of how have things changed pre-crisis and post-crisis? What's the impact? And as far as the split of those questions, we looked at this from both a traditional assets point of view and an alternative assets point of view. And alternative assets in this context is quite important because I think Guernsey has a particular specialism. Certainly PE, property, and some of the other alternative assets have a significant impact on the finance industry over here. So interestingly, pre-investment, what we're really seeing is that there has been some moves. So the work that people like to do before they commit and sign the check has gone up, and you can see there that the movements between alternatives and traditional is roughly the same. So those that said that this is the most important thing have gone up from 7% to 11%. But the interesting movement is the post-investment piece. And you can see there the biggest swing in the entire survey landed in this post-investment box for alternative assets. And in that regard, the alternative assets piece has moved from just 3%, which says to us that the majority of those clients, once they've made their investment in their private equity fund or their real estate fund or whatever that might look like, largely just waited until they redeemed at the end of that and would maybe give some kind of high-level monitoring, but nothing more. That has moved dramatically. So post-crisis, people have had their fingers burnt. They are now far more interested in what's going on in their portfolio. So the shift from 3% to 17%. And although you can see a similar movement there on traditional assets, it's not so pronounced. And that involves a challenge because traditional assets are generally liquid and they're generally marketed and they generally are traded on an exchange. Alternative assets are generally not. So there are a whole range of complexities that drive that question, which poses financial services groups like ours with challenges around data management and data collection. So I guess my point in putting some of this in front of you is to say, a lot of what we've been hearing so far is not just interesting academic debate with some interesting sociological implications for us as a society. When we look at it through a business lens, there are some very real drivers today that we as service providers need to address. And these need to be addressed pretty much straight away. The way we manage data and the way we hold data is crucial to providing a good ongoing service. The use of data. So how do firms, our clients, get hold of their data? Who is it that's responsible for providing the data and analysing it? And what we found here was that the majority of firms that we've spoken to rely on internal IT specialisms within their firm to get hold of the data. And you can see there's a whole range of different options that they go to, market data feeds, in-person visits on site. But whatever it might be, the vast majority still own data collection internally. And so we were interested in that to try and test to see, is that likely to stay the same or is it likely to change? And certainly some of the interviews that we've held concur with our own view, which is that that is beginning to change and change dramatically. Firms are beginning to feel very uncomfortable with having this millstone of data gathering, data storage and analysis on their own necks, because quite frankly many of them are not really equipped to deal with it. So although there's only 6% that outsource completely their data management function today, we think that that's going to change dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years. And the other question that we asked from a governance perspective is who is it that's responsible for data management programs within organizations? And this was interesting because we got no consensus really at all from the people that we spoke to. Each firm had its own particular flavor of this. Given what I said earlier about a lot of risk management being driven by portfolio risk management, then the investment committee is probably the one which is up there with the largest responsibility assigned to it, 33%. So I don't know about you, but I've always found that when you allocate responsibilities to a committee rather than into an individual, you don't necessarily get a very clear vision and direction in quite the same way as you do from one of the C-suite individuals in an organisation. So there will be a particular style which will be associated with a committee structure. There are a few where the chief investment officer or some of the other C-suite individuals take ownership, going right down to firms that don't have anyone that's allocated. And interestingly, compliance fit in there and chief risk officers fit in there as well. So what we're seeing is that the industry at the moment has not really got a clear strategy of who owns the responsibility for their data management program, and they don't clearly have a mechanism for a way of devising a plan for the future. So a lot of open questions. And really, that gives you a bit of a sense of where we think at the moment a lot of the financial services industry is. And there's a drive. There are some conclusions that we feel are relevant. First of all, developing transparency policies and formally assigning ownership. They are beginning to happen. We have ILPA from a private equity industry point of view, but we also have other industry standards that are beginning to evolve around the globe. But that's work in progress, and there's still work to be done. The second thing is understanding what can be outsourced. The question of outsourcing data is a very sensitive question, and it's something that firms will consider very, very carefully. Making sure that there are service providers that are equipped and can be trusted to hold data on behalf of a firm and their clients is an extremely important question. But at the same time, the industry is reaching an inflection point where clearly a decision needs to be made to either invest internally or to find someone else that can support and help. Aggregating data is a first step along a journey to really properly using data in an effective way. Providing expertise in analysing and interpreting and presenting data. These are all skill sets which again feel to us that they are still in their infancy from a financial services point of view. there's still a long way to go before we really feel we've arrived in that particular journey. Supporting and adopting standards, conventions, and developed by industry bodies. This is also work in progress, and it's something that we feel is an extremely important component. It is no good being able to analyse and process and store data if what you end up with is a series of results which don't bear any relationship to the broader market and to a client's other assets and the rest of the portfolio that they own. So we're in a state of flux. So, blockchain, Guernsey, what does all of this mean? Well, I think the reason in sharing that, I think, is to try and convey the impression that Guernsey clearly has a financial services industry that forms an important part of our broader economy. And there are some major challenges out there in the globe at the moment which we're already beginning to think about and come up with solutions for from a local perspective. An example, and I think there are probably other examples as well that the island can quote, and we've heard about those already this morning. The example that I would talk about is the blockchain revolution. And by that, what I mean is not just blockchain, but the whole distributed ledger technology, which we feel is transformational, both the financial services industry and more broadly in the way that data is being held across the globe. So this is a slide that was produced in 2016, the World Economic Forum, and it just gives a bit of an indication of how much money is being invested in blockchain and distributed ledgers. So 80% of banks predicted to initiate blockchain projects by 2017. So by the end of this year, the prediction is that 80% of banks will be investing significant sums in this technology. At the time that the report was produced, over 1.4 billion invested over the previous 3 years. 90 plus central banks and regulators worldwide are engaged. 90 plus corporations have joined a blockchain consortia, and so on and so on. And what's interesting as well, we had a question earlier on about patents and intellectual property. 2,500 plus patents have been filed in the last 3 years that relate to this technology. So there's clearly some competitive activity going on here as well, but this indicates to me that this is transformational, and that certainly Northern Trust and Guernsey are not alone in making significant commitment to this particular piece of technology. Most of you will be aware that Northern Trust did develop a blockchain solution. And as far as that goes, I think you've probably heard a little bit about the background already, but I'll just quickly dwell on what this is and how it works. What we're really talking about here is a single version of the truth for any of the records that are maintained for private equity business and for a private equity fund. So if you think about a shared database, which is almost instantly updated across a whole range of different users or nodes in such a way that it is completely reliable and is a completely honest version of the truth for any of the users at any given point in time. And you add to that, because it's digital, it can be encrypted and it can be made safe, you start to develop a whole different way of thinking about private equity, because a lot of the contractual arrangements and paper and agreements that get put in place can be embedded into that digital environment, and any of those users can rely on the same data without the need to have to reconcile it and assure it through other means. And what that does is really make a transformational shift in the way that private equity works. So we put together a product nearly a year ago now, and have been working on it really over that time, so that we do have something that replicates the private equity service provision at the time it was put into place. What we're now doing as a group, and we're working with a range of different advisors, both on island and off island as well, so very much a collaborative approach, is to start analysing and deconstructing the whole private equity fund process and the value chain. And what we're finding is that as you think it through from a distributed ledger point of view, we're effectively ripping up the old manual and rewriting it for new. And the way that private equity funds will work in the future we think will be radically different. And as we look at each stakeholder and each service provider in the chain, and you can see some of them there, the general partner, the limited partner, the auditor, the promoter, they all will have a different experience and a different way of executing their responsibilities and obligations to the investor base that are investing in the private equity fund. So it's a very interesting, very exciting program. And what's great is that Guernsey's at the forefront of that. And from a Northern Trust point of view, we're delighted that that is the case. So that's private equity, and that was the project that we undertook. So more will follow in due course. But I guess I wanted to really just leave you with a few final thoughts around blockchain, distributed ledgers, and what this means. There's a lot more to this than private equity. There's clearly all sorts of different applications. This is a fundamentally shifting piece of technology. So the way that we record real-time data, universal blockchain data utilities will provide distributed golden records. We will be able to transact business almost instantly using blockchain technology in a way that we've not been able to do before. The whole asset servicing business, so that's what we do as fund administrators and as custodians, will change. So the life cycle will speed up, a lot of intermediaries can be cut out, and it will become, again, a far more efficient process. ID. Now, this is an interesting point because digital identity frameworks clearly represent a challenge for blockchain in one sense because it's very difficult to delete records. But if blockchain is able to give the individual control of their own data and actually provide permission to whoever wants to use it by way of a password, that actually changes the whole debate around ID. So there's some quite interesting implications for ID and the way we manage that when you look at it from a distributed ledger point of view. Frictionless settlement. So this again isn't just PE, this is across the whole financial services market, being able to disintermediate a lot of the things that we do today. Issuance of new securities, and trade execution. All of these are going to be touched by blockchain. And what you can see there in the diagram is one blockchain talking to a series of other ecosystems which also use blockchain and be able to actually operate almost instantaneously and being able to communicate with each other in a way that we just haven't seen today. So, transformational technology. Thank you all very much indeed.